I always think of my love for reading as being a progression. Let's think of it as a love story. So you have the early books I read, which were more of the got me started in reading. I was reading as fast as I could. It was words and they were new to me and they were exciting. But I was just feeling all that poppy young love towards books, right? And then I got a bit older, a bit more mature, and then I found another set of books that I considered not puppy love this time around, but teenage love, you know, when you're discovering who you are and discovering what you like and discovering what takes your breath away. And for me, the books that fit that, yeah, they are kind of the ones that cemented my love for reading. Hello everybody, Nora back again. So I decided I was going to do a video talking about the 10 books that cemented my love for reading. Because a lot of times you say, okay, these were the books that got us started on reading and everything else. But I do believe that there's a difference between the book that started you off and the book that sealed it for you and made you realize that this is the real deal. You really do love reading. So the very first book for me is The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. And how do I capture the joy and the excitement that I felt reading that book? I wanted to be Peter, I wanted to be Susan, I wanted to be Edmund, I wanted to be Lucy. They were having these grand magical adventures, visiting new worlds, meeting a talking lion, battling a witch, saving the world. Their stories resonated with me because they were children just as I was a kid when I was reading it, and I just felt like their lives were more fun and magical than mine, which is understandable because they are fictional and I am not. But I think that was the very first book that helped me realize that fiction could be in itself an escape, but at the same time that there are qualities in these characters that I can take into my own life and I can use to guide my behavior going forward. Of course, there were other books that reinforced and drive this home for me, but this was the very first book where I first started catching glimpses of that. Which leads me to the second book on my list, and that is, to no surprise of anybody at all, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Now, I read Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone because my dad got me the UK edition of the book. I can't find it anymore. And it was just... Here was an 11-year-old boy who had been through hell, who was orphaned and maltreated, but still managed to keep his goodness. And on his 11th birthday, he got a letter that changed his life. I met a giant who would become integral to his life. I made friends and went to his school and had adventures. Adventures that filled several pages. Adventures that spilled onto 6 other books. And I remember reading Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone and just feeling awed and happy. Like, that book filled me with so much happiness and I could not stop reading. I started Philosopher's Stone. Immediately I was done, I moved on to Chamber of Secrets and then Prisoner of Azkaban, and I just kept going until I was with the rest of the world waiting for the last 2 books to come out. And I guess Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was the very first book that got me invested in a series. Right, in a series of books, because I wanted to follow his trajectory. I wanted to follow the trajectory of his friends. I wanted to see more of their lives, and I still owe my love for series, because even till date I prefer books that are series to standalone books, because although standalone books have their merit, series for me just further expand into people's lives, and you can tell so much more stories with the series than you would with a standalone novel. And I do believe that my love for series I can trace back to Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. The third book on my list is If Tomorrow Comes by Sidney Sheldon. Now, I have not read this book in like forever. It's been a very long time. But this book would always hold a special place in my heart because it was from If Tomorrow Comes that I learned, or rather, I acquired my appreciation and love for morally ambiguous characters, for characters who are hell bent on revenge, who like to twist the law a bit in order to suit their needs and purposes. And this was a book that cemented my belief that human beings, especially if you're writing a book and your characters are to be as realistic as possible, nobody is perfect and people have agendas. Nobody exists in this world that does not want something, you know, and all it just depends in what lengths you're willing to go to, and also what lengths you're willing to go to get your revenge, especially when you've been framed for a crime you did not commit. And I loved the fact that it was fast-paced. I loved the fact that it had intrigue, and I especially love the fact that that was my first meeting of a morally ambiguous character, and I loved her. I loved her to bits. Tomorrow Comes would always be that bitch for me. The fourth book that cemented my love for reading is Sons of Fortune by Jeffrey Archer. Now, this book had intrigue, it had suspense, it was fast-paced, and it also sealed my love for stories that span several decades. I love sagas, and following the story of Fletcher and Nat, two twin boys separated at birth who took different paths in life and then converged when they were both contesting for a governorship position, it was a read. It was that book I could not put down. This was the very first book that had me switching seats in class. So I sat at the back because I could not stop reading. I think I missed like 3 periods in school then because I sat at the back and I had to finish the book. For all the classes that happened, I was physically there, but I was not mentally there. I was in the pages of a book. And then the minute school ended, I ran home. I couldn't sleep that night. I could not drop the book down until I was done. And that was the first time a book was evoking that amount of love and devotion in me. That all, I cannot put you down until I know how you end, until I know how the story goes. I still remember the way my heart beat fast and I could not stop. I could not look away from the pages. I needed to know what happened, like I needed to breathe. And that was Sons of Fortune was a book. I do not know if I will still feel the same way if I read it today, but I know that past Noria loved that book. The fifth book on my list is the first smutty-ish book I ever read, and that was Heiress by Dailey. Now, I didn't have Heiress. It was my mother's book. My mom loved to read when I was growing up, and although our books were more adult themed, I kind of still borrowed them without her knowing because I finished my books and I was looking for more books to read in the house, and I saw Heiress and I was like, okay, fine. The premise was interesting and I picked it up and I read it. Now, looking back, I am 100% certain that if I was to read Heiress today, I probably would be like, this book is absolute drivel. But younger me loved that book. Younger me was invested in reading the story of the Texas heiress who lost everything after her father died, and was also hit with a double whammy of a realization that her father had an illegitimate daughter who basically he had been investing money for. And so when he died and left the heiress with debts and no home to speak of, the illegitimate daughter inherited everything. And it just became this battle between both sisters. They married, they had extramarital affairs, they had children, they had like epic loves, all to the end. It was drama. The book was salacious, the book had drama, and the book had sex. And that was my very first introduction to a smutty novel. And I was intrigued. And I liked it. I remember reading that book and, of course, sneaking it so that my mom would not catch me reading it. And When I finished it, I was like, okay, I enjoyed it. It was cool, but okay. And then I moved on to something else. But that was my very first smutty introduction. Of course, taste in smut has improved since then. But for a very first attempt, it was not a bad introduction. Could I have waited until I was a bit older? Maybe. But I was a precocious child and I did not know how to keep my hands to myself, so. Next book on the top 10 books that cemented my love for reading is the very first Sabrina the Teenage Witch by J.J. Weiss and Cody Weiss. Yes. Sabrina was my very first introduction into the fact that books can be light. They can be light and breezy and just a fun read without you trying to figure out what hidden messages that the writer was trying to tell you. Like, that book was so breezy. It was a weekend of fun type of thing. I had fun. It started with her discovering her powers, her floating above the bed, her going to school. And I remember I laughed so much and I smiled so much. And Sabrina was my introduction into the fact that reading could also help me turn things off. That there are books for those moments when you do not want to really think deep thoughts, where you just want to unwind and relax and not think about anything beyond a surface level of enjoyment. And Sabrina just confirmed for me that there's a book for every emotion, there's a book for every goal I wanted to achieve. And in this case, the goal I wanted to achieve was to just forget shit and let shit go. And this book more than delivered. And I just love it for teaching me that, because it just meant that I just loved reading more. Because I knew at that point in time that if I wanted a serious book, I could get a serious book. And if I wanted a light, easy, breezy read, then I could get that. The next book on my list is Silas Marner by George Eliot. Now, Silas Marner was the very first classic that we were mandated to read in school, but I ended up loving it. I loved it so much. I remember I read it about 9 to 10 times in the space of 3 years. So yes, I was reading it about 3 times a year. That was how much I loved that book. I found it a heartwarming story. I loved Silas. He was your cranky, moody, older man with a heart of gold that was buried underneath the hurt that society had given him. I loved Epi, the girl he found and raised as his own. Silas Marner was my first introduction into the found family trope, which is one of my favorite tropes in books till date, because I'm a firm believer in the fact that family does not necessarily have to be biological, that they can also be chosen. And Silas Marner was the first book that helped me see that and did it in such a way that younger me could not really put it into words, but I just knew how that book made me feel and I loved it. That is a classic that I would always go back to, that I can always read and I would always love, because it also helped me realize that I can actually love classical books. And after that, I ended up loving Shakespeare, I ended up loving Dickens, I ended up loving Nikolai Gogol. But before they all came, there was George Eliot, and she was amazing. And I love Silas Marner. The next book on my list is The Lion and the Jewel by Wole Soyinka. Now, that was the very first play I actually read that I actually really, really enjoyed. Before then, I'd read The Weiss Revolt by John Pepper Clark, which at that point in my life, I did not really enjoy it because I did not really understand it. And I was like, okay. I'd also read Olarotime's The Gods Are Not to Blame, but I thought it was plagiarized and I did not really like it. So, but Lion and the Jewel, I enjoyed Lion and the Jewel. That was a play that I could see in my head a stage performance. And as I was reading it, that was how I was seeing the entire story play out. I was invested in CD and Lakunle and Baroka, and I wanted to see how their story would unfold, because that was the OG love triangle. That was the very first ever love triangle I ever came across in a book. And I wanted to say exactly how it would play out. Of course, I believe now very firmly that Sidney would have been better off alone, because she deserved better than either of the two men. But younger Noria was invested in that story, and because of that, younger Noria realized that, oh, okay, plays were also a form of entertainment that she could really love and enjoy reading, because before then I stuck primarily to prose. But after that, I was all up with plays because I enjoyed it. The next book that cemented my love for reading has to be Neil Gaiman's Sandman. Prior to that, I used to read comics, but they were not consistent, and I didn't really love them as much as I loved, other books, other form of literature. And then I read Sandman, and then I realized that comics could be cinematic as fuck, that they could contain characters that I would love. They could have plots that could jump across different genres, the way I love them to in like regular books. And then I realized that they could have characters that would haunt me and stay with me, whose lives I could be invested in. And I also realized that comics could be like series, in the sense that they could have stories that would span several issues and several books, and a plethora of characters I could love. I remember I could not stop reading Sandman. When I first discovered it, I read it straight for about 2 weeks, non-stop. I did not watch any movie. I did not read any other book. I was just so invested in reading all about dream and desire and death and delirium and destruction and destiny and despair. Reading about Cain and Abel, reading about the way Neil Gaiman just brought in, Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology. I love the fact that at any and every given point in time, you could not tell exactly what it was that you were going to get. Sandman surprised me, which said a lot, because up until that point, I had not really read any comic that surprised me. But Sandman did, and I could not put it down. And when I was done, I realized that there are actually comics like this. Comics that would blow my mind and change my thoughts on life and what it meant and how it was to be lived. The last book on my list is Arrow of God by Chinua Achebe. Now, I know a lot of people, when you hear Chinua Achebe, the book that comes to mind is Things Fall Apart. And I love Things Fall Apart. I read Things Fall Apart. But I read Arrow of God a couple of years after Things Fall Apart. And I was old enough to really understand the themes that was present in the book. Especially because at that point in time, I did understand what the British colonial rule had been like. In the sense that I'd read it in books, so I had a better understanding. And I could see what Achebe was trying to paint with the book, that the colonial masters used Christianity as a weapon in the further subjugation of the Igbo people. And that hit so well. And I remember when I finished reading the book, I sat down and I was stunned. And I just felt like my eyes had been opened to something new. Like, that was the first book that not only entertained me, but also gave me a historical context into something that I did not know so much about. Because I know it was moving forward from there that I started doing my own research and started reading some more. But up until that point, my understanding of religion and how it worked and how it was brought into Nigeria was pretty limited. And Arrow of God was just eye-opening. One more reason why, after I finished reading it, I went looking for every single Chinua Achebe book that I had not yet read. So I looked for No Longer at Ease. I went to look for A Man of the People. I went to look for Girls at War. If it was an Achebe book and I could find it, I was going to read it. And it was because of Ezeolu's daughter, Obiageli, because he wrote her with such feminist subtext that you had to look right for you to get it. And when you did, you realized that these are the women that populate Igbo land, you know, strong, vocal, opinionated women. And I enjoyed reading that book so much. It was full of proverbs and folklore and folk songs, and the language was so simplistic but so powerful. It read like my grandmother herself was reading me and telling me the story. And that is another reason why Arrow of God it made me love Achebe's writing, and it made me love reading even more, to find those little nuggets of history and wisdom and feminism in text. So yeah, those were the 10 books that cemented my love for reading. Let me know down in the comments below some of the books that you would say not just got you into reading but actually cemented your love. Like, at what point did you read a book and realize that you had gone from casual reader to die-hard bookworm? Please do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I make new videos every Sundays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and I will see you soon. Bye.